Sometimes the loneliest men recognize each other without saying a word. The girl stood at the edge of Elias Boone's ranch with dust covering her boots and wind pulling strands of black hair across her face, while the late Arizona sun burned orange behind her like the whole desert had caught fire. She couldn't have been older than 24. Thin, tired, quiet. But there was something wrong about the way she stood there. Not weak, not broken. Still, like someone who had walked through worse things than hunger. Elias sat on the porch sharpening a rusted horseshoe nail when he first saw her shape coming through the heat waves rolling across the empty land. Most travelers avoided his ranch. The place sat nearly 12 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dry grass, old fence posts, and memories nobody wanted. Folks in Black Hollow called it Ghost Ranch because no laughter had come from it in over a decade. Elias preferred it that way. The wind made fewer demands than people. The girl stopped beside the wooden gate and rested one hand against the post, as if she'd walked 100 miles without sleep. Elias didn't move, didn't speak. The old hound sleeping beneath the porch lifted its head once, then settled back down without barking. That alone made Elias uneasy. Dogs knew things men ignored. The girl looked toward him carefully. "I just need work," she said softly. Her voice barely carried over the wind, but it reached him anyway. Elias kept the nail in one hand. "Town's east. Town doesn't hire Apache girls." The words landed flat and honest. No pity in them. No anger either. Just truth. Elias finally stood, slow and stiff from years of ranch labor and colder years after that. His shadow stretched long across the porch boards while the leather of his gun belt creaked quietly at his waist. He studied her face beneath the dust. Brown eyes, sharp cheekbones, sunburn across her nose, tired hands. But what froze him wasn't the girl herself. It was the silver necklace hanging against her throat, a small turquoise stone wrapped in old silver wire. Elias felt something tighten hard inside his chest. He knew that necklace. 20 years ago, during a winter storm, near the White Mountains, a native woman had dragged him half-frozen into a cave after his horse collapsed in the snow. She had saved his life without asking his name. Before dawn she vanished, leaving only a fire, a strip of rabbit fur, and that same silver necklace glinting beside the ashes. Elias had searched for her for months afterward. Never found her. Yet now the necklace hung from the throat of a stranger standing in his yard asking for work. The wind shifted. The smell of rain drifted faintly through the dust though the sky remained clear for miles. Elias realized he'd been staring too long. The girl noticed too. Her fingers brushed the necklace instinctively. "Something wrong?" she asked. Elias looked away first. "Where'd you get that?" She hesitated. Just enough for him to notice. "Family." "What family?" Her eyes lowered toward the dry earth. "The kind that doesn't stay in one place long." Elias grunted softly. Not an answer, but not exactly a lie either. Somewhere behind the barn, a loose shutter banged once against wood. The sound echoed across the ranch like a warning. Elias glanced toward the empty horse pen where dust swirled around broken rails. He hadn't hired help in 11 years. Didn't trust strangers near his land. Trouble usually arrived smiling before it burned your life down. Still, the girl looked exhausted enough to fall over where she stood. "You know horses?" he asked finally. "Better than most men. Can you mend fence?" "If the hammer's honest." Elias almost smiled at that. Almost. The girl shifted her weight carefully, and for the first time he noticed the limp. Small, hidden well, but there. She'd been walking hurt and never mentioned it once. That bothered him more than if she'd complained. Silence settled between them while the evening wind pushed dust through the yard in slow waves. Far off somewhere, thunder rolled across the mountains. Elias looked past her toward the desert trail stretching west into Apache territory. No wagon tracks. No horse. She'd come alone. That meant either courage or desperation. Sometimes both looked the same. "Name?" he asked. "Nayeli." "You running from something, Nayeli?" She met his eyes then, and for one strange second Elias felt like the whole desert had gone still around them. "Aren't we all?" she answered quietly. The old hound beneath the porch stood up now, tail low but wagging once. Elias noticed it immediately. The dog hated strangers. Had bitten 2 salesmen and a preacher over the years. Yet now it walked slowly toward Nayeli and pressed its nose against her hand like it already knew her. Nayeli scratched behind its ears gently. "What's his name?" "Brutus." "He's lonely." Elias looked toward the empty ranch house windows glowing gold in the setting sun. So am I. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Nayeli looked up sharply, surprised by the honesty in his voice. Elias hated that too. He cleared his throat hard. Barn needs cleaning. Horses need water before dark. Food's after work. Nayeli nodded once. No smile. No thank you. Just relief hidden deep behind tired eyes. She stepped through the gate slowly, carrying nothing except a small cloth bag over one shoulder and the silver necklace against her chest. As she passed him, Elias caught the faint scent of cedar smoke and desert sage. The same scent from that cave 20 years ago. His pulse stumbled hard once. Nayeli paused beside him. You're staring again, she said quietly. Elias looked toward the horizon where the last sunlight bled red across the land. Just trying to decide whether letting you stay is the worst mistake I've made in years. Nayeli glanced toward the darkening desert behind her. Then we have something in common. And somewhere far beyond the ranch, hidden behind the red hills and dying sunlight, riders were already moving toward Ghost Ranch. The ranch had forgotten what another pair of footsteps sounded like. Elias noticed it before sunrise the next morning while standing beside the old water pump with a tin cup in his hand. Usually the place woke slowly. Wind first, then cattle, then the dry creaking of old wood shifting beneath heat that had not even arrived yet. But now there was something else moving through Ghost Ranch. Quiet, steady, human. He looked toward the barn and saw a lantern light glowing faintly through the cracks in the boards. Nayeli was already awake. Elias checked the sky out of habit. Pale blue spreading slowly across the desert. Maybe 5:30 in the morning. Most ranch hands he had hired years ago would still be sleeping under blankets, smelling like whiskey and excuses. Yet smoke already drifted from the barn chimney. Elias walked across the yard with Brutus following close behind, his boots pressing into cold dirt still damp from the night air. The closer he got, the stranger the silence felt. No curses, no banging tools, no complaints, only the soft brushing sound of hay being moved carefully by hand. Elias pushed open the barn door halfway and stopped. Nayeli stood beside the black mare nobody on the ranch could calm except him. The horse usually snapped at strangers and kicked hard enough to splinter fence rails. But now the massive animal stood perfectly still while Nayeli brushed dirt from its coat in long, slow motions. She was speaking softly in Apache under her breath. Not loud enough to understand, just enough for the horse to lower its head. Morning light spilled through the wooden slats across her shoulders and dark braid, while dust floated gold around her like smoke in church sunlight. Elias crossed his arms. That horse does not like people. Nayeli kept brushing calmly. She does not like fear. Elias glanced at the mare. She nearly threw a deputy through a fence last spring. Deputies smell nervous. Elias leaned against the doorframe. You always talk in riddles? Nayeli finally looked at him. Only to men who ask questions they already know the answer to. That almost made him laugh. Almost. Instead, he walked deeper into the barn and noticed every stall had fresh water already filled. Feed buckets cleaned. Saddle blankets folded neatly over the rail. Even the old lantern glass had been wiped clear. Elias frowned slightly. You did all this already? Could not sleep. Most people would. Nayeli set the brush down. Most people do not arrive at a stranger's ranch with nowhere else to go. The honesty in her voice sat heavy between them. Elias looked away first. Outside, wind pushed through the dry grass in long whispers. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried across the empty morning. He took another sip from his tin cup. There is bacon left in the kitchen. Nayeli nodded once. Thank you. Again, no smile. No softness. She spoke gratitude like someone unfamiliar with receiving kindness often enough to trust it. Elias noticed her limp more clearly now while she carried feed sacks toward the stalls. Small but real. Her left boot dragged slightly when she thought nobody was looking. How bad is the leg? He asked suddenly. Nayeli stiffened almost invisibly. It works. That bad, huh? She ignored him and reached for another sack. Elias stepped forward before she could lift it. You are going to tear something carrying 80 pounds like that. I have carried worse. That does not make it smart. Their hands brushed briefly against the rough burlap sack. The contact lasted less than a second, but Nayeli pulled away quickly like touching people was something dangerous. Elias lifted the feed himself and carried it into the next stall without another word. He hated noticing small things about her. Hated noticing how carefully she watched every doorway before entering a room. Hated noticing how she sat facing windows. Hated noticing the exhaustion hidden beneath her calm expression. Those were habits built by hard roads. Hard roads usually brought hard stories behind them. By noon, the desert heat rolled over the ranch in thick waves. Elias worked fence lines while Nayeli repaired harness straps beneath the shade of the porch. Neither spoke much. Somehow the silence did not feel uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Around 2 o'clock, a rider appeared near the eastern ridge. Elias saw the dust trail first, then the horse. Deputy Vernon Pike. Thin mustache. Loudmouth. The kind of man who wore polished boots on dirt roads. Elias muttered under his breath. Trouble finally remembered where I live. Nayeli looked up immediately. Not scared exactly. Alert. Like a deer hearing a twig snap deep in the woods. The deputy rode into the yard and tipped his hat lazily. Afternoon, Boone. Elias stayed near the fence post. Pike. The deputy's eyes shifted toward Nayeli sitting beneath the porch shade. His expression changed instantly. Well, now he said slowly. Town was wondering if the rumors were true. Elias already felt irritation crawling beneath his skin. Town ought to find better hobbies. Pike dismounted carefully, brushing dust from his vest. Sheriff heard an Apache woman was seen heading west yesterday. Thought maybe you had seen something. Nayeli continued stitching the leather strap calmly, without looking up once. Elias admired that more than he wanted to admit. Most people got nervous around lawmen, even when innocent. You found her, Elias said flatly. Pike chuckled once. Careful, Boone. Folks in Black Hollow are nervous lately. Folks in Black Hollow stay nervous. It gives them purpose. The deputy's smile faded slightly. There are stories moving through town. Riders spotted near the southern hills. Apache movement. Nayeli's stitching slowed almost invisibly. Elias noticed. So did Pike. You know anything about that, girl? The deputy asked. Nayeli lifted her eyes slowly. Calm. Steady. Do you? Pike stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed awkwardly and adjusted his belt. You people always answer questions with questions? Only the important ones. Elias had to hide his grin behind a coffee cup. Pike looked irritated now. Good. The deputy climbed back into his saddle and pointed toward Elias with 2 fingers. Sheriff says keep your eyes open. If riders come through this territory, town will expect cooperation. Elias nodded once. Town always expects things. Pike rode off muttering beneath his breath while dust followed him down the trail. Silence settled over the ranch again after the hoofbeats disappeared. But it felt different now. Tighter somehow. Like the air before a storm finally breaks. Elias looked toward Nayeli beneath the porch. You know those riders he mentioned? Nayeli tied off the leather stitching carefully before answering. I know what happens when frightened men start inventing enemies. Elias leaned against the porch rail. That sounds like experience talking. Nayeli stared west toward the red hills glowing beneath afternoon sun. Her voice lowered almost to a whisper. Experience usually survives longer than innocence. Then she stood slowly and carried the repaired harness into the barn while Elias watched her disappear into shadow. And for the first time in years, Ghost Ranch no longer felt empty. That should have comforted him. Instead, it unsettled him more than he could explain. By the 3rd morning, Elias Boone realized the ranch no longer sounded like a graveyard. The change was small at first. A bucket set down beside the well before sunrise. The smell of coffee already warming over the stove when he entered the kitchen. Soft footsteps crossing old wooden floors that had spent years carrying only his weight and silence. Ghost Ranch had been empty so long that even ordinary sounds now felt almost unnatural. Elias stood near the sink washing dust from his hands while pale morning light spilled through the kitchen window. Nayeli sat quietly at the table repairing one of his torn work gloves with thick thread and a bone needle she carried inside her cloth bag. She worked carefully, head lowered, dark braid resting over one shoulder. The old silver necklace caught sunlight each time she moved. Elias noticed himself staring at it again. He hated that. You are going to burn a hole through me if you keep looking at that necklace, Nayeli said without lifting her eyes. Elias grunted softly. Maybe I am trying to decide if it is real. Maybe you already know it is. He dried his hands with a towel and leaned against the counter. Woman I knew once wore one just like it. Nayeli's stitching slowed slightly. Knew her well. Elias looked out the window toward the horse pasture where morning wind rolled across dry grass in silver waves. Not really. But you remember her. Some people leave marks deeper than others. Silence settled again. Not uncomfortable. Just heavy with things neither of them seemed willing to touch directly. Outside, Brutus barked once toward the hills before falling quiet. Elias frowned immediately. The old hound rarely barked without reason. He stepped onto the porch and scanned the distant ridges glowing red beneath early sunlight. Nothing moved except heat waves rising from the desert floor. Still, something felt wrong. Like eyes watching from far away. Nayeli appeared behind him, carrying the repaired glove. "You hear that?" Elias asked. "The silence," she answered quietly. It changed. He glanced toward her sharply. Most people never notice changes in silence. Nayeli did. That unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Around noon, the heat settled hard over the ranch, turning the air thick enough to taste dust with every breath. Elias spent hours repairing fence posts near the north pasture, while Nayeli worked beside the horse trough, sharpening rusted tools against a whetstone. She moved with strange confidence around ranch work for someone who claimed she only needed a job. Not fast. Efficient. Every motion deliberate. Like she had spent years surviving by learning useful things quickly. Elias hammered a nail into the fence rail and finally spoke without looking at her. "You ever work a ranch before?" "No." "Then how do you know saddle repair?" "My grandfather believed every person should know how to fix what keeps them alive." Elias wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Your grandfather sounds like a difficult man." Nayeli's mouth almost curved into a smile. Almost. He was respected. Those two things usually travel together. Before Elias could answer, Brutus suddenly rose from beneath the wagon shade and stared west toward the hills. Low growl, deep in his throat. Every muscle in the old dog tightened. Elias felt cold move slowly through his chest despite the heat. Nayeli stood immediately, her eyes locked toward the same distant ridge. "Someone is there," she whispered. Elias followed her gaze but saw only red stone and drifting dust nearly half a mile away. "You can see that far?" Nayeli did not answer right away. Then quietly, "You learn to notice movement when people spend their lives hunting you." The words sat between them like a stone dropped into still water. Elias looked at her carefully now. "Who exactly is hunting you, Nayeli?" She lowered her eyes. "The wrong kind of men." That answer usually means trouble. Trouble does not need invitations. It just needs directions. Elias muttered under his breath. "You and your riddles again." But deep down he knew she was right. Trouble always found lonely places. Eventually. Especially places trying too hard to stay forgotten. Late afternoon brought clouds rolling down from the mountains, dark and heavy enough to swallow the sun little by little. Wind pushed harder through the valley now, carrying the smell of rain and distant cedar smoke. Elias secured loose tools beneath the shed roof, while Nayeli gathered blankets from the clothesline before the storm arrived. Thunder rumbled softly somewhere beyond the hills. Then came the hoofbeats. Fast. Close. Elias stepped into the yard immediately. A rider burst through the blowing dust and pulled hard on the reins near the front gate. Sheriff Walter Grady. Thick gray mustache. Heavy coat despite the heat. The sheriff looked more nervous than tired, which worried Elias far more. "Boone," Grady called sharply. "Need a word." Elias walked closer while Nayeli remained near the porch holding folded blankets against her chest. The sheriff noticed her instantly. His jaw tightened. "So the rumors are true." Elias crossed his arms. "Rumors usually are." Grady lowered his voice slightly. 3 ranches south of Black Hollow reported riders watching the roads last night. Nayeli's fingers tightened subtly around the blankets. "And?" Elias asked. "And people are scared. People are always scared. This is different." The sheriff leaned closer in the saddle. "Some folks think Apache scouts are moving through the territory again." Elias looked toward Nayeli briefly before answering. "Thinking has never been Black Hollow's strongest skill." Grady ignored the remark. "Town council wants strangers reported." His eyes shifted toward Nayeli again. Especially now. Wind whipped dust across the yard between them. Nayeli stood perfectly still beneath the darkening sky. No fear on her face. Just exhaustion. Old exhaustion. The kind carried too long. Elias suddenly found himself irritated by the sheriff's stare. "She works here," he said flatly. "That all?" Grady asked. Elias held the sheriff's gaze. "That is all you need to know." The sheriff studied him for several seconds. Then thunder cracked louder across the valley. Finally, Grady pulled the reins tight. You always did enjoy standing in front of storms, Boone. Elias glanced toward the black clouds gathering above Ghost Ranch. Maybe Storms and I understand each other. The sheriff rode off slowly into the dust while evening shadows stretched long across the land. Nayeli remained silent until the hoofbeats faded completely. Then softly, you should not defend people you barely know. Elias picked up the tool bag beside the fence. Funny thing about lonely men, he said quietly. After enough years, they stop caring what frightened crowds think. Nayeli looked at him differently after that. Not softer exactly, but something guarded inside her shifted slightly. The first drop of rain struck the dirt between them. Then another. Far away beyond the western hills, hidden beneath gathering storm clouds and fading daylight, riders continued moving toward Ghost Ranch. And if you have made it this far into the story, leave a comment and press like because the storm coming for Elias Boone is only beginning. Rain arrived hard after sunset. Not the soft kind that tapped gently against windows and disappeared by morning. This rain came heavy and cold, rolling across the Arizona desert in dark sheets that turned dust into mud within minutes. Wind rattled the loose shutters of Ghost Ranch while thunder echoed through the valley like distant cannon fire buried beneath mountains. Elias Boone sat near the fireplace with a coffee cup warming his hands, listening to the storm move through the old house one creak at a time. Across the room, Nayeli knelt beside Brutus near the hearth, carefully wrapping fresh cloth around the old dog's front paw after noticing a cracked pad from dry ground. The hound rested calmly beneath her hands, eyes half closed in the firelight. Elias watched the scene quietly over the rim of his cup. Strange. That was the only word for any of this. Strange that the house no longer felt dead. Strange that Brutus trusted her completely. Strange that he had stopped counting the hours until she left. Firelight danced softly across the silver necklace resting against Nayeli's throat while shadows shifted along the wooden walls. Outside, rain hammered the roof hard enough to drown most sounds. Most sounds. Except one. Hoofbeats. Elias lowered the coffee cup slowly. Nayeli heard them too. Her hands froze against Brutus's paw. Both of them looked toward the front door at the same moment. 3 riders by the sound of it. Maybe 4. Coming fast. Elias stood immediately and reached for the rifle hanging beside the fireplace out of habit more than fear. Nayeli rose beside him, her expression suddenly tight in a way he had never seen before. Not panic. Recognition. Do you know them? Elias asked quietly. Nayeli did not answer. The hoofbeats stopped outside the house. Wind pushed rain hard against the windows while leather saddle straps creaked faintly somewhere beyond the porch. Then came 3 slow knocks against the front door. Not loud. Controlled. Elias glanced toward Nayeli once more before stepping forward carefully. Stay back, he muttered. Elias. Her voice stopped him halfway across the room. He turned. Do not open the door, angry. That sentence settled heavily in his chest because only someone used to danger would say something like that. Elias rested one hand against the rifle stock and opened the door halfway. Rain exploded inward immediately, cold and sharp against his face. 3 riders sat mounted beneath the storm. Apache men, their horses dark with rainwater, their faces unreadable beneath dripping hats and wet braids. The rider in front appeared older than the others, with gray woven through his long hair and deep lines cut into his weathered face like dried riverbeds. His eyes moved past Elias instantly and found Nayeli standing near the fireplace. Something shifted in the old rider's expression. Relief. The smallest breath of it. Nayeli stepped forward slowly into the firelight. Tomas, she said softly. The older rider lowered his head respectfully. We have been searching for you across 3 territories. Elias felt the room tighten around him. Nayeli glanced toward him briefly before speaking again in Apache too fast for him to understand. The old rider answered calmly, though his eyes kept drifting toward Elias with careful interest. Rainwater dripped steadily from the men's coats onto the porch boards while thunder rolled overhead again. Finally, Nayeli switched back to English. They came to make sure I was alive. Elias crossed his arms. That usually means somebody thought you might not be. The older rider looked directly at Elias now. There are men searching for her, he said in slow, careful English. Bad men. Elias almost laughed at how familiar those words sounded. Everyone carried bad men behind them these days. You could have said that before riding onto my porch in the middle of a storm. The rider ignored the remark politely. You are Elias Boone. Not a question. Elias felt his grip tighten slightly around the rifle. Depends who is asking. A man who owes your name respect. The old Apache reached slowly inside his coat and removed a small leather bundle wrapped carefully against the ring. He handed it toward Elias. Inside rested an old silver necklace chain broken clean through near the clasp. Elias stared at it silently. Same turquoise stone. Same silver wire wrapping. Same necklace. His pulse stumbled hard once again. Where did you get this? He asked quietly. The older rider nodded toward Nayeli. From her grandmother. Elias looked at Nayeli immediately. Firelight flickered across her face while rain hissed against the roof overhead. Your grandmother saved my life, he whispered. Nayeli lowered her eyes slightly. She told stories about a stubborn white rancher who nearly froze to death because he thought pride mattered more than weather. Elias let out one rough breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Almost. The old rider spoke again. Her grandmother carried your name with honor until the day she died. Silence settled heavily across the room after that. Elias did not know what to do with those words. He had spent years believing nobody remembered him beyond Black Hollow and his failing ranch. Yet somehow his name had traveled through Apache fireside stories for 2 decades. The storm outside softened slightly now, rain easing into steady rhythm against the roof. Brutus walked toward the riders calmly and sniffed their wet boots without fear. Nayeli moved closer to the doorway. You should not have come here, she said quietly in Apache. Tomas answered with visible concern in his eyes. They are closer than you think. Elias noticed it immediately, the fear hidden beneath the old man's calm voice. Not fear for himself, fear for her. Who was looking for her? Elias asked sharply. Tomas studied him carefully before answering. Men who believe some bloodlines should belong to powerful people. Elias frowned. That does not explain much. It explains enough. Nayeli suddenly stepped forward. No, her voice carried more force than before. He does not need this. Tomas looked between them slowly. He already has this. Wind pushed through the open doorway again, carrying the smell of wet desert earth and distant cedar smoke. Somewhere far across the valley, lightning flashed white against the hills. Elias felt the strange pressure building beneath all these half-answers and unfinished truths. He hated mysteries, especially one standing inside his house wearing familiar silver necklaces. Tomas finally climbed back onto his horse slowly. Lock your doors tonight, Elias Boone, he said quietly, and do not trust riders who arrive smiling. Then the 3 Apache men disappeared back into the storm without another word, leaving only hoofprints in the mud and silence hanging heavy inside Ghost Ranch. Elias closed the door carefully and turned toward Nayeli. Firelight flickered between them while rain whispered softly overhead now. You mind telling me why people keep crossing half the desert looking for you? Nayeli stared into the flames for several long seconds before answering. Because some families are born carrying things other people would kill to control. Elias waited for more. None came. Nayeli finally looked toward him, tiredness deep in her eyes again. I told you before, Elias. Trouble does not need invitations. Then she walked quietly toward the small room beside the kitchen and shut the door softly behind her while Elias remained standing beside the dying fire with the broken silver necklace chain still resting heavy in his hand. The desert smelled different after rain. Cleaner somehow, like the earth had finally exhaled after holding its breath too long. Morning sunlight spread slowly across Ghost Ranch, turning puddles into strips of gold while steam rose from wet fence rails and dark soil. Elias Boone stood alone beside the horse corral with Tomas's broken silver necklace chain resting in his palm. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the old Apache rider's expression when he spoke Nayeli's name. Respect. Fear. Loyalty. Men did not ride through storms for ordinary people, especially not men like Tomas. Elias closed his fingers around the broken chain and slipped it carefully into his coat pocket just as the ranch house door creaked open behind him. Nayeli stepped onto the porch carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. The morning breeze lifted loose strands of her dark hair while sunlight caught the turquoise stone around her neck again. Elias hated how much that necklace unsettled him. She walked toward him quietly and handed over 1 cup. You look like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts, she said softly. Elias accepted the coffee without looking at her. Thoughts usually run faster. Nayeli leaned lightly against the fence beside him. The horses shifted calmly nearby, tails flicking lazily at flies. For a few moments neither spoke. Just wind moving through wet grass and distant thunder fading far beyond the mountains. Finally, Elias glanced toward her. You could leave, you know. Nayeli looked surprised. That is not what you want. Maybe not. But it might keep this ranch from becoming part of whatever follows you. Nayeli lowered her eyes toward the coffee steaming between her hands. You think I bring danger? Elias answered honestly. I think danger already knows your name. Something passed across her face then. Sadness maybe. Or guilt carried too long. My grandmother used to say storms always chase certain bloodlines harder than others, she whispered. Elias frowned slightly. That sounds like the kind of thing old people say when they want to sound mysterious. A small smile touched the corner of Nayeli's mouth. She would have liked you. That sentence landed strangely inside him. Too warm for a man who had spent years speaking mostly to cattle and silence. Before Elias could answer, Brutus suddenly barked from near the barn. Sharp. Alert. Both of them turned instantly. A wagon rolled slowly up the trail toward Ghost Ranch, wheels crunching through wet mud left by the storm. Elias recognized the driver immediately. Martha Bell, owner of the general store in Black Hollow. Widow, tough as railroad iron and twice as stubborn. She stopped the wagon near the porch and climbed down carefully, adjusting her coat against the morning wind. Her eyes moved directly to Nayeli. Not hateful, just concerned. Town's talking again, Martha said without greeting. Elias sighed softly. Morning to you too. Martha ignored him and walked closer. Walter Grady says Apache riders were seen near Copper Ridge before dawn. Nayeli remained calm beside the fence. And Martha crossed her arms. And frightened people make poor decisions. Elias muttered under his breath. That might be the smartest thing said in Black Hollow all year. Martha looked toward Nayeli again. Girl, whether you deserve it or not, people are going to blame you for every shadow moving through these hills. Nayeli nodded once. They already do. Martha's expression softened slightly at that. You are younger than I expected. Nayeli gave the faintest shrug. Fear usually imagines people larger. Elias almost smiled into his coffee. Martha reached into the wagon and pulled out a wrapped cloth bundle. Brought supplies before the roads flood again. She handed it toward Elias, then lowered her voice carefully. 3 men arrived in town late last night asking questions. Elias's jaw tightened immediately. Questions about who? Martha glanced toward Nayeli briefly before answering. A woman wearing silver and turquoise. Silence settled hard around the yard. Wind pushed softly through the cottonwood trees near the creek, while somewhere overhead a crow cried once across the pale sky. Elias looked toward Nayeli slowly. She had gone completely still. Did they say who they were, he asked. Martha shook her head. No badges. No ranch brands either. But decent horses. Expensive coats. Men with money usually scare me more than outlaws. Elias knew exactly what she meant. Men with money often hid cruelty beneath clean hands and polished boots. Nayeli stared toward the western hills again, face unreadable now. How far behind me are they? Martha hesitated. Close enough. The breeze shifted suddenly, carrying the scent of cedar smoke again. Elias noticed Nayeli inhale sharply at the smell. Not fear this time. Memory. You know these men, he said quietly. Nayeli stayed silent for several seconds too long. Finally she whispered, I know what they want. Which is? Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. Control. Elias waited. That is not much of an answer. Nayeli looked toward him then, and for the first time since arriving at Ghost Ranch, genuine exhaustion showed openly in her eyes. Because the full answer gets people hurt. Martha studied both of them carefully before stepping back toward her wagon. Whatever this is, Elias, Black Hollow is turning ugly already. She paused beside the wagon wheel. You might want to decide which side of this storm you stand on before the storm decides for you. Then she climbed back into the wagon and rode slowly toward town, leaving deep tracks through the wet earth behind her. Elias watched the wagon disappear beyond the ridge while unease settled heavier inside his chest. Beside him, Nayeli quietly removed the turquoise necklace from around her neck for the first time since arriving. Elias stared as she opened the silver clasp carefully. Hidden inside the stone setting was a folded piece of paper no larger than a matchbook. Old, worn thin from years, hidden inside the necklace. Elias looked at her sharply. What is that? Nayeli unfolded the paper slowly with trembling fingers. Symbols covered the inside in faded ink alongside one English sentence written carefully across the bottom. Elias read it aloud before he could stop himself. When the Red Valley burns, trust the man who carries winter in his eyes. Silence crashed down around them both. Wind moved softly through the ranch, while somewhere far beyond the hills a horse cried faintly across the desert. Elias looked up slowly. What the hell does that mean? Nayeli stared directly into his eyes for the first time that morning. My grandmother wrote it before she died. Elias frowned. Why would she write? Something about me. Nayeli's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Because she knew one day people would come searching for what my family carries. Elias felt cold move through him despite the warming sun. And what exactly does your family carry, Nayeli? She folded the paper carefully back into the necklace. Then softly, almost sadly, something men with power would destroy entire towns to possess. The rest of the afternoon passed beneath a silence so heavy even the wind seemed careful moving through Ghost Ranch. Elias Boone repaired tack inside the barn, while Nayeli sat near the open doorway, turning the turquoise necklace slowly between her fingers. Dust floated through strips of sunlight cutting between the wooden boards, and somewhere outside a loose chain tapped softly against a fence post over and over like an old clock refusing to stop. Elias tried focusing on the saddle in front of him, but his thoughts kept circling back to the folded paper hidden inside the necklace. Something men would destroy towns to possess. The sentence would have sounded ridiculous coming from almost anyone else. But not from her. Not after the writers. Not after Tomas. Nayeli suddenly looked toward the western hills again. Elias noticed it immediately. She did that often now. Like part of her was always listening for something beyond the horizon. You planning to tell me the truth anytime soon? He asked without looking up from the saddle straps. Nayeli remained quiet long enough for him to think she might ignore the question completely. Then softly, the truth depends on who survives hearing it. Elias let out a tired breath. That sounds dramatic even for you. A faint smile crossed her face before fading again. My grandmother used to say dangerous things rarely arrive sounding simple. Elias set the saddle down harder than intended. Dust jumped from the leather. You know what I think? Nayeli looked at him calmly. I think you have spent so long running that you forgot some people can choose to stay. Her eyes lowered toward the floorboards. That silence again. The kind carrying old wounds beneath it. Outside, Brutus barked once near the front gate before trotting toward the house. A moment later, hoofbeats rolled across the yard. Elias stepped outside immediately, with Nayeli following close behind. A single rider approached through the afternoon heat. Young, maybe 25. Expensive coat. Black horse with silver reins polished too clean for ranch work. Elias disliked him before the man even spoke. The rider stopped near the porch and removed his gloves carefully. Afternoon, he said with a smooth smile that never reached his eyes. Name is Victor Hale. Elias stayed near the steps. Did not ask. Victor's gaze shifted toward Nayeli almost instantly. Not surprise. Recognition. Elias felt it the second it happened. Nayeli's body tightened subtly beside him. Victor smiled wider. There you are. Elias stepped slightly forward without thinking. You know her? Not personally. Victor dismounted slowly. But some people have been looking for Miss Nayeli for quite some time. The desert wind moved softly through the yard while clouds drifted slowly across the sun overhead. Elias noticed Nayeli's fingers curling tightly around the necklace resting at her throat. Fear. Real fear this time. Victor noticed too. You do not need to be frightened, he said gently. I came peacefully. Elias grunted softly. Men usually say that right before trouble starts. Victor laughed politely. Fair point. Then his eyes returned to Nayeli. Your family sent many people searching for you. Some kinder than others. Nayeli finally spoke. I am not going back. Victor's smile faded slightly around the edges. You may not have a choice. Elias folded his arms. Funny thing about choices. Most people still get one. Victor studied Elias carefully now. And you are? Owner of the ranch you are standing on. Oh. Victor nodded slowly. Elias Boone. Elias's expression hardened immediately. You know my name too? People with important connections often become important themselves. Victor reached slowly inside his coat and removed a folded document sealed with dark wax. I represent investors from Santa Fe interested in acquiring land rights across this territory. Elias did not take the paper. You rode 12 miles through mud to discuss land? Not land. Victor looked directly at Nayeli. Her. Silence dropped hard across the yard. Even the horses near the corral seemed restless now, shifting against their reins. Elias felt something cold settle deep inside his chest. You planning to explain that? He asked quietly. Victor sighed like a businessman frustrated by unnecessary complications. Miss Nayeli's family possesses knowledge tied to old Apache territories. Knowledge about what? Victor's smile returned carefully. Silver. Nayeli looked away immediately. Elias noticed. Victor continued smoothly. A valley hidden for generations. Rich enough to change this territory forever. Elias let out one rough laugh. So this is about money. Everything becomes about money eventually. Victor stepped closer carefully. The problem is Miss Nayeli's bloodline carries the final map. Elias glanced sharply toward Nayeli. She still would not meet his eyes. That true? He asked. Her silence answered loudly enough. Wind swept dust across the yard between them. Victor spread his hands calmly. No one wishes her harm, Mr. Boone. We simply need cooperation. Elias stared at the polished silver buttons on Victor's coat. Men dressed like that rarely dirted their own hands. But they always hired people willing to. And if she refuses? Victor's expression softened into something almost sympathetic. Then less patient men will eventually arrive. Nayeli stepped forward then, voice steady despite the fear beneath it. You already destroyed enough lives searching for that valley. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly for the first time. Careful. No, Nayeli whispered. You be careful. For several long seconds nobody moved. Heat rolled across the ranch while storm clouds gathered again far beyond the mountains. Finally Victor adjusted his gloves and stepped back toward his horse. You have until the next full moon, he said quietly. After that, events may become difficult for everyone involved. Elias watched him mount the black horse smoothly. You threaten people often? Victor glanced back once. Only when they confuse greed with patience. Then he rode away down the muddy trail, leaving silence hanging behind him. Like smoke after a fire. Elias remained standing in the yard long after the hoofbeats disappeared. Beside him, Nayeli looked smaller somehow beneath the endless Arizona sky. Not weak, just tired in a way deeper than exhaustion. Elias finally turned toward her. Silver. Nayeli closed her eyes briefly. It was never about silver. Then what is it about? She looked toward the western hills glowing red beneath the sinking sun. Control over land. Water. Tribes. Railroads. Whoever owns that valley decides what happens to thousands of people. Elias rubbed one rough hand across his jaw slowly. And your family kept the location hidden all these years. Nayeli nodded. My grandmother believed some places should stay untouched. And you? Nayeli's voice lowered almost to a whisper. I think some men ruin everything they touch. Elias looked at her carefully then. Really looked. Not the Apache girl who arrived asking for work. Not the mystery wrapped in silver and silence. Just a tired young woman carrying the weight of something far too large for one person alone. The evening wind lifted dust across Ghost Ranch while the first stars slowly appeared above the desert. Elias spoke quietly. You should have told me sooner. Nayeli swallowed hard before answering. I stopped believing people stayed after hearing the truth. Elias stared toward the darkening horizon where Victor Hale had disappeared. Then finally, maybe you just met the wrong people before. Nayeli looked at him differently after that. Softer. Sadder. Like hope itself frightened her more than danger ever could. And if you are still here listening beside the fire and dust of Ghost Ranch, thank you for staying with this story. That night the desert turned strangely quiet. No coyotes. No wind scraping against the barn walls. Even the horses stood restless beneath the moonlight, ears twitching toward the western hills, as if they sensed something approaching long before human eyes could see it. Elias Boone sat alone on the porch steps with a lantern beside his boots and an untouched cup of coffee cooling slowly in his hands. Across the yard, Nayeli stood near the fence line staring into darkness beyond Ghost Ranch. Silver moonlight painted the edges of her braid and shoulders while the turquoise necklace rested cold against her throat again. She looked like someone listening for ghosts. Elias had known many kinds of silence in his life. The silence after funerals. The silence after storms. The silence inside empty houses where memories still walked the floors at night. But this silence felt different. Waiting silence. Dangerous silence. Brutus suddenly lifted his head beside the porch and gave a low, uneasy growl. Elias noticed immediately. "You expecting company?" he asked quietly without looking toward Nayeli. "No," she whispered. "That is what worries me." Elias rubbed one rough hand across his jaw slowly. "You ever going to explain why men with money and Apache riders both seem willing to cross half the territory looking for you?" Nayeli remained facing the hills. "Would it change anything if I did? Might help me decide how much trouble I have invited onto my land." A faint sad smile crossed her face. "You invited me before you knew any of this." Elias stared into the dark yard ahead. "Maybe that says something stupid about me." Nayeli finally turned toward him then. "No, it says something kind." Those words hit harder than they should have. Elias had spent years hearing people describe him as stubborn, bitter, lonely, difficult, haunted. Kind had disappeared from the world's vocabulary around him a long time ago. He looked away first. Somewhere far beyond the hills, lightning flickered silently behind distant clouds, though no thunder followed. Heat lightning. Desert lightning. The kind that glowed beautiful from far away while starting fires nobody noticed until morning. Nayeli walked slowly toward the porch and sat beside him on the wooden steps. Not too close, but closer than before. The lantern between them cast warm gold across the dust, while crickets finally began singing faintly near the creek bed. "My grandmother believed land remembers people," Nayeli said softly after a long silence. Elias grunted lightly. "Sounds like Apache wisdom. You do not believe it?" Elias took a slow drink of cold coffee. "I think land remembers footprints. Men just pretend. It means more." Nayeli studied him quietly. "Then why did you never leave this ranch?" That question settled heavily between them. Elias stared out across the moonlit pasture where old fence posts stretched toward darkness like broken ribs across the earth. "Because leaving felt too much like surviving," he answered finally. Nayeli said nothing. Elias appreciated that more than any comfort she could have offered. Most people rushed to fill silence because they feared it. Nayeli respected silence like it carried its own language. Wind moved softly through the cottonwood trees near the creek. Elias leaned his elbows against his knees. "Wife and son died here 12 years ago," he said quietly. "House fire started during a dust storm. By the time neighbors reached the ranch, his voice faded before finishing. It did not need finishing." Nayeli lowered her eyes. "I am sorry." Elias nodded once. "Town blamed me for years. Said I should have been home earlier. Said I should have noticed the chimney crack sooner." Nayeli looked toward the dark ranch house windows. People fear grief because it reminds them nothing is permanent. Elias glanced sideways at her. "You always talk like someone twice your age." "My grandmother raised me." "That explains it." For the first time since arriving at Ghost Ranch, Nayeli laughed softly. Quiet. Real. The sound caught Elias completely off guard. Strange how laughter changed a person's face. The sadness remained, but now he could see the warmth beneath it too. Before either could speak again, Brutus stood abruptly and barked hard toward the ridge above the north pasture. One bark, then another. Elias rose instantly. Nayeli stood beside him at the same moment. Movement. 3 shadows crossing the ridge line against moonlight. Riders. Elias narrowed his eyes. Victor Hale again. Nayeli shook her head slowly. "No, how can you tell?" Her voice lowered almost to a whisper. "Because these riders are not hiding." The figures stopped along the ridge overlooking Ghost Ranch. Silent. Watching. Moonlight glinted faintly off metal somewhere among them. Elias felt cold settle through his chest despite the warm desert night. "Friends of yours?" Nayeli did not answer immediately. Then softly, "No one watching from a hill at midnight arrives as a friend." The riders remained still for several long moments before finally turning away one by one and disappearing beyond the ridge. No threats shouted. No weapons drawn. Just shadows fading back into darkness. Somehow that unsettled Elias more than open danger would have. He looked toward Nayeli carefully. "You recognize them?" "Not the men." Her fingers tightened around the turquoise necklace again. "But I recognized the warning." Silence settled across Ghost Ranch once more after the riders vanished. Even the crickets had stopped singing again. Elias picked up the rifle leaning beside the porch door and checked the chamber quietly out of habit. Naeli watched him for a moment. You think that will help? She asked gently. Elias rested the rifle against his shoulder. No, then why carry it? He looked toward the hills where the riders disappeared. Because men sleep easier pretending they can protect things. Naeli's expression softened sadly. You are not pretending. Elias did not answer. The lantern flame flickered harder as wind moved through the porch again. Somewhere beyond the darkness, horses cried faintly across the valley. Naeli suddenly looked toward the barn. Did you hear that? Elias listened carefully. At first nothing. Then faintly. Hoofbeats again. But slower this time. One horse only. Coming from the eastern trail, leading toward Black Hollow. Elias stepped off the porch into the moonlight, while Naeli moved beside him. The lone rider approached carefully through drifting dust until the horse emerged fully into view. Sheriff Walter Grady. Except something was wrong. The old lawman looked pale beneath the moonlight. Exhausted. Frightened. He pulled hard on the reins near the gate and stared directly at Elias. You need to listen carefully, Grady said breathlessly. Black Hollow is gathering men tonight. Elias felt the air change instantly. For what? The sheriff looked toward Naeli with visible concern in his tired eyes. Then quietly, they think she brought the riders. The words hung in the night, air heavier than thunder. Sheriff. Walter Grady remained mounted beside the gate, breathing hard beneath the moonlight, while sweat darkened the collar of his coat despite the cool desert wind. Elias Boone stared at him for several long seconds without speaking. Beside the porch steps, Naeli stood perfectly still, one hand resting lightly against the turquoise necklace at her throat like it anchored her to the earth beneath her feet. Somewhere beyond the hills, coyotes finally began crying again. Soft, distant, the kind of sound that made lonely places feel even lonelier. Who exactly is gathering men? Elias asked quietly. Grady swallowed once before answering. Half the town if rumors keep spreading. Elias let out one rough breath through his nose. Rumors built Black Hollow before the railroad ever did. This is different. Grady glanced toward the dark ridges surrounding Ghost Ranch. Folks saw riders watching the hills tonight. Then Victor Hale starts whispering about hidden Apache gold and land claims. Elias's expression hardened immediately. Victor Hale talks too much for a man wearing clean boots. The sheriff nodded grimly. And frightened people listen too easily when money gets mentioned. Naeli finally stepped forward into the moonlight. What are they planning? Grady hesitated. That hesitation told Elias enough before the sheriff even spoke again. They think if they bring you into town peacefully, the riders will stop circling Black Hollow. Naeli lowered her eyes briefly. Not fear this time. Weariness. Deep and old. Elias stepped between her and the gate without thinking. No, the sheriff looked tired more than surprised. Elias. No, Elias's voice remained calm. Flat. Certain. Town can blame storms on her next if they want. She is not going anywhere. Wind pushed dust softly across the yard while moonlight silvered the wet fence rails left from yesterday's storm. Grady removed his hat slowly and rubbed one hand across his gray hair. You know I came here before anyone else because I respect you. Elias answered quietly. Then respect me enough to tell Black Hollow to stay off my land. The sheriff looked toward Naeli again. Girl, if people believe Apache riders are gathering because of you, this territory is going to turn ugly fast. Naeli nodded once. It always does. Those 4 words carried something ancient inside them, like history itself speaking through her voice. Grady sighed heavily. Victor Hale has been buying drinks all evening and talking about silver valleys hidden by Apache bloodlines. Elias muttered under his breath. Thought so. Men who could barely afford lamp oil last week are suddenly dreaming about fortunes. The sheriff's face tightened beneath the moonlight. Greed makes decent people dangerous. Elias stared out across the dark pasture. No, greed just reveals what they already were. Silence settled again. Somewhere inside the barn, one of the horses stomped nervously against wood. Naeli slowly walked past Elias toward the gate. He caught her wrist gently before she reached it. What are you doing? She looked toward him calmly. Maybe this ends if I go with him. Elias's grip tightened slightly. You believe that? Naeli stayed quiet. That answer frightened him more than if she had said yes. Elias stepped closer, lowering his voice. Listen carefully to me. Men chasing money do not stop because someone surrenders quietly. Naeli looked up at him then, moonlight catching the sadness in her eyes. You do not understand what they want. Maybe not. Elias glanced toward Black Hollow glowing faintly far off beneath the night sky. But I understand crowds. Grady slowly climbed down from his horse and approached the porch carefully. Elias, he said quietly, I do not think you realize how serious this is becoming. Elias looked toward the sheriff. And I do not think Black Hollow realizes how serious I am. The old lawman studied him for several long seconds before nodding once in tired understanding. He had known Elias Boone long enough to recognize stubbornness carved in stone. Then you need to prepare, Grady said softly. Because by sunrise people are going to come asking questions. Questions I can handle. Grady's eyes drifted toward Naeli again. Can she? Silence answered for her. The sheriff sighed heavily once more and handed Elias a folded piece of paper from inside his coat. Victor Hale left this at the saloon tonight. Elias unfolded it beneath the porch lantern. A rough map covered most of the page. Red marks circled sections of desert west of Ghost Ranch. At the bottom, written in sharp black ink, were 4 words. The valley belongs to progress. Elias felt cold spread slowly through his chest. Progress, he muttered bitterly. Funny word for men planning to steal things. Grady lowered his voice further. I also heard something else. Elias looked up. What? Victor Hale is not working alone. Wind moved through the cottonwood trees again, while clouds drifted slowly across the moon overhead. Who was backing him? Elias asked. Grady hesitated carefully before answering. Railroad investors from Denver. Mining companies from Santa Fe. Men with enough money to bury entire towns beneath contracts and fences. Naeli closed her eyes briefly at those words. Elias noticed immediately. You knew, he said quietly. She nodded once. My grandfather warned this day would come. Then why stay here? Naeli looked toward Ghost Ranch. Toward the porch lantern glowing warm against darkness. Toward Brutus sleeping beneath the wooden steps. Toward Elias standing between her and the world without asking for anything in return. Because I was tired of running alone, she whispered. Those words hit Elias harder than he expected. Hard enough that he looked away immediately toward the distant hills. The sheriff climbed back into his saddle slowly. I will buy you both some time if I can, he said quietly. But by morning, I know, Elias interrupted. Grady nodded once, then turned his horse toward Black Hollow. Before riding away, he paused beside the gate one final time. For what it is worth, he said without looking back, your wife would probably be proud of you tonight. Then he disappeared into the moonlit desert, leaving Ghost Ranch wrapped once again in silence and starlight. Elias stood motionless long after the hoofbeats faded. Beside him, Naeli looked smaller somehow beneath the endless sky. You should not risk your life for me, she whispered. Elias let out one quiet breath. Too late for smart decisions now. A faint smile touched her face before fading again. Wind lifted her dark braids softly while moonlight glimmered across the necklace at her throat. Elias looked toward the western hills where unseen riders still watched from darkness beyond the ranch. Get some sleep, he said finally. Naeli frowned slightly. And you? Elias rested one hand against the rifle leaning beside the porch. I think I will stay awake tonight. She studied him carefully for a moment. Then quietly. Lonely men always think they have to guard everything themselves. Elias almost smiled. Maybe because nobody else ever stayed long enough to help. Naeli stepped closer then. Close enough for him to smell cedar smoke and desert sage again beneath the cool night air. I stayed, she whispered softly. Neither moved after that. Somewhere far beyond Ghost Ranch, thunder rolled low across the mountains though the stars above them remained clear and cold. By dawn the desert looked bruised beneath a sky the color of cold iron. Thin clouds drifted low across the valley while wind rolled through Ghost Ranch carrying dust and the bitter smell of distant smoke from Black Hollow. Elias Boone had not slept. He stood near the front gate with a rifle resting loosely against his shoulder and dark circles beneath his eyes while Brutus paced nervously beside the fence line. Across the yard, Naeli poured water into the horse trough as calmly as if the world beyond the ranch was not preparing itself for trouble. That unsettled Elias almost more than fear would have. You always this calm? He asked quietly. Naeli glanced toward him over her shoulder. No, could have fooled me. She lowered the bucket carefully into the trough. Fear is loud inside me. I just learned not to feed it where others can see. Elias watched her silently for a moment. Morning sunlight touched the silver necklace around her throat while the breeze lifted dust around her boots. Strange how quickly Ghost Ranch had begun shaping itself around her presence. The empty chair beside the stove no longer looked abandoned. The barn no longer sounded hollow. Even the old hound followed her around the property like she belonged there. That thought sat dangerously, warm inside Elias's chest. He did not trust warmth anymore. Warm things disappeared too easily. A faint rumble rolled across the valley. Not thunder. Wagon wheels. Elias turned toward the eastern road immediately. Nayeli stopped pouring water at the exact same moment. 2 wagons and at least 8 riders approached through the drifting dust below the ridge. Black hollow men. Elias recognized several hats before faces. Ranchers, store clerks, laborers from the rail camp east of town. Ordinary men carrying fear in their posture and rifles across their saddles. The worst kind of crowd. Because ordinary men convinced they were righteous could become cruel faster than outlaws ever did. Nayeli set the bucket down slowly. They came earlier than I thought. Elias shifted the rifle slightly. You expected them? People always arrive faster when someone promises them gold. The wagons rolled into the yard and stopped roughly 30 feet from the porch. Sheriff Grady rode near the front looking exhausted already while Victor Hale sat beside him wearing the same polished coat and controlled smile as before. Elias disliked him more every minute. Victor climbed down first, brushing dust from his sleeves carefully like even dirt offended him. Mr. Boone, he called smoothly. We hope this could remain civilized. Elias leaned one shoulder against the fence post. Funny way to describe arriving with half a town behind you. Men shifted uneasily atop their horses while wind creaked softly through the old ranch sign hanging near the barn. Nayeli remained beside the trough, silent but alert. Victor looked toward her immediately. Miss Nayeli. She did not answer. Victor sighed almost theatrically. This does not need to become unpleasant. Elias let out one dry laugh. You keep using peaceful words while bringing armed men. Victor spread his hands calmly. Fear makes people cautious. Greed makes them stupid. Several riders exchanged uncomfortable glances at that. Sheriff Grady finally stepped forward, voice low and tired. Elias, let us just talk this through. Elias looked toward the sheriff carefully. You lose control of your town already? Grady's silence answered. Loudly enough. Victor pulled a folded paper from inside his coat and held it up for everyone to see. The investors I represent have legal authority to survey land throughout this territory. Elias did not move. Congratulations. Victor's smile tightened slightly. Miss Nayeli possesses information tied directly to disputed land ownership west of the valley. You mean she knows where the silver is? One of the riders muttered from behind the wagon. Immediately, several others began whispering among themselves. Elias noticed Nayeli lower her eyes briefly at